The lone rider appeared as a mirage against the horizon, a silhouette wavering in the heat that rose from the parched earth of the Texas plains. Grace Ellwood pulled her wagon to a stop, squinting against the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. She had been traveling for days, her destination the small town of Shafter where her late uncle's general store awaited new management. It was 1878, and the West was still wild, still dangerous for a woman traveling alone, but Grace had never been one to shy away from danger. The rider approached steadily, and as he drew closer, Grace could make out the broad shoulders, the weathered hat, and the easy way he sat his horse, a true cowboy. She relaxed slightly, though her hand remained close to the small pistol tucked beneath the folds of her skirt. This was Texas, after all, and caution was as necessary as water. "Afternoon, madam," the rider called as he pulled his mount to a stop beside her wagon. His voice was deep, pleasant, with the slight drawl typical of these parts. "Name's Tucker Sloane. You headed to Shafter?" Grace nodded, taking in his appearance tall, sun-bronzed, with eyes the color of the summer sky. "Grace Ellwood," she replied, offering a small smile. "Yes, I'm bound for Shafter. My uncle passed, left me his store. I'm to take it over." Tucker raised his eyebrows. "You'd be Jasper Ellwood's niece, then. Sorry for your loss, madam. He was a good man." "Thank you. Did you know him well?" Everyone knew Jasper in these parts. Tucker glanced at the sky. "Sun's getting low. Shafter's still a good 2 hours' ride. I'd be happy to escort you, if you'd allow it." Grace considered the offer. She was tired, and the thought of company was appealing after days of solitary travel. "That would be most kind, Mr. Sloane." "Just Tucker, madam. No need for formalities out here." As they continued toward Shafter, Grace found Tucker to be a pleasant companion. He spoke of the land, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area. He didn't pry into her past, for which she was grateful. Chicago seemed a world away now, as did the scandal that had driven her west. The sun was dipping low when they finally crested a hill, and Shafter spread before them a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street, smoke rising from chimneys, horses tied at hitching posts. It wasn't much, but to Grace, it represented a fresh start. "That's your uncle's place?" Tucker said, pointing to a 2-story building with a wide porch. "Store downstairs, living quarters up top." "It's larger than I expected," Grace admitted, feeling a flutter of nervousness. Running a store alone would be challenging, but she was determined to succeed. Tucker escorted her to the door where a stern-faced older woman awaited them, keys in hand. "Mrs. Winters." Tucker nodded in greeting. "This is Miss Ellwood, Jasper's niece." Mrs. Winters looked Grace up and down, her expression softening slightly. "Been expecting you. Got everything ready upstairs. Store's been closed since Jasper took ill, but inventory's all there." "Thank you for your kindness," Grace said, accepting the keys. Tucker removed his hat. "If you need anything, Miss Ellwood, I'm at the Broken Spur Ranch, just outside of town. Mrs. Winters can point you in the right direction." Grace thanked him, watching as he mounted his horse and rode away. There was something about Tucker Sloane, something in his eyes that spoke of depths beneath the courteous exterior. But she had a store to revive and a new life to build. Romance was the furthest thing from her mind. The following weeks passed in a blur as Grace settled into life in Shafter. The townsfolk were curious about her, this educated Eastern woman who spoke properly and dressed neatly even as she learned to manage inventory, haggle with suppliers, and keep the books. Some were skeptical that she could succeed, but many remembered her uncle fondly and gave her a chance. Tucker Sloane came by occasionally, sometimes to purchase supplies, sometimes seemingly just to check on her. He was unfailingly polite, removing his hat when he entered the store, calling her Miss Ellwood, despite her invitations to use her given name. One evening, as Grace was closing up the store, the door opened, bringing a gust of autumn air. Tucker stood there, looking troubled. "Evening, Miss Ellwood. Sorry to bother you after hours." "Not at all. What can I help you with?" He twisted his hat in his hands. "Got word a group of men are planning to rob the bank tomorrow. Sheriff's out of town, won't be back until late. Thought you should know. Keep the store closed, maybe." Grace's heart quickened. "Are you certain?" "Heard it from a reliable source. I'll be in town, keeping watch, but—" He hesitated. "Be careful is all." Before she could thank him, he was gone, striding down the street toward the saloon. Grace locked the door, her mind racing. She had heard stories of bank robberies, of course, but hadn't expected to face such danger so soon. The next day, Grace kept the store closed as Tucker had suggested. From her window upstairs, she watched the street, tense and alert. Around noon, she spotted them 4 men on horseback, bandanas pulled up over their faces, rifles visible in their saddle holsters. They dismounted outside the bank. What happened next unfolded like a scene from a dime novel. Tucker and several other men emerged from buildings along the street, guns drawn. Words were exchanged, though Grace couldn't hear them. Then, suddenly, gunfire erupted. Grace gasped, pressing closer to the window. One of the would-be robbers fell, clutching his leg. Another took aim at Tucker, who dove behind a water trough. The battle was brief, but intense. When it ended, the robbers were in custody, being marched to the jail. One limped, supported by his companions. Tucker looked up as they passed the general store, catching Grace's eye at the window. He tipped his hat, a gesture that brought unexpected warmth to her cheeks. That evening, a knock at the store's back door startled Grace. She opened it cautiously to find Tucker, a small cut on his cheekbone but otherwise unharmed. "Wanted to make sure you were all right," he said, standing awkwardly on her back step. "I should be asking you that," Grace replied, gesturing to his face. "Please, come in. Let me tend to that cut." Tucker hesitated but followed her inside. Grace lit a lamp and gathered clean cloth and water. As she gently cleaned the cut, she became acutely aware of his proximity, of the steady rise and fall of his chest, of the subtle scent of leather and open prairie that clung to him. "You were brave today," she said softly. "Just did what needed doing." His eyes met hers and something passed between them, a current of understanding. "Been riding with the Rangers on and off. Old habits?" "A Texas Ranger?" Grace couldn't hide her surprise. A shadow crossed his face. "Former. Left after—" He stopped, then continued. "Left a while back." Grace sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Everyone in the West had a past, often one they preferred not to discuss. She of all people understood that. As autumn deepened into winter, Grace found herself looking forward to Tucker's visits. He began staying longer, sometimes helping her with tasks around the store, sometimes simply talking. She learned he had grown up in East Texas, that he had a talent for breaking horses, that he read voraciously despite his limited formal education. She told him about Chicago, about her father's shipping business, about her love of music and art. She didn't tell him about Richard Bradford, the married businessman whose unwanted advances had led to vicious rumors when she rejected him, forcing her to leave the only home she'd known. Some wounds were still too fresh. The first heavy snow of winter brought Shafter to a near standstill. Grace was surprised when Tucker appeared at the store, snow dusting his shoulders and hat. "Thought you might need help bringing in wood," he explained, stamping his boots on the threshold. After they had stocked the woodbox, Grace impulsively invited him to stay for coffee. They sat at her small kitchen table, steam rising from their cups, the wind howling outside. "Why did you really come to Shafter?" Tucker asked suddenly, his blue eyes serious. "A woman like you belongs in a city, with theaters and fancy restaurants, not out here in the middle of nowhere." Grace looked down at her coffee. Sometimes we end up where we need to be, not where we thought we would be, she said carefully. Tucker nodded, accepting her non-answer. Well, I'm glad you're here, however it happened. The sincerity in his voice made her look up, meeting his gaze. For a breathless moment she thought he might reach for her hand, but instead, he stood abruptly. Better get back to the ranch before the snow gets worse, he said, reaching for his coat. Grace felt a stab of disappointment but masked it with a smile. Thank you for the wood and the company. At the door, he paused. There's a social at the church next Saturday. Dancing, food, that sort of thing. Would you consider attending with me, Miss Ellwood? Grace's heart fluttered. I would be delighted, Tucker. His smile transformed his face, erasing the usual gravity. I'll come by at 6 then. After he left, Grace pressed her hands to her warm cheeks. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself to feel such things, and it both thrilled and terrified her. The church social was a lively affair. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A fiddler and a piano player provided music, while tables groaned under the weight of dishes brought by the townsfolk. Tucker looked different in his Sunday best, still rugged, but more polished. When he offered Grace his arm, she took it, aware of the curious glances from the other attendees. The general store owner and the cowboy from the Broken Spur made an unexpected pair. They danced, Tucker moving with surprising grace for such a tall man. His hand at her waist was respectful, proper, yet Grace was conscious of every point where they touched. When the music slowed, he pulled her slightly closer, and she didn't resist. You're the talk of the town, he murmured, amusement in his voice. Am I? Grace asked, a little breathlessly. The Eastern lady and the cowboy. Makes for good gossip. There was no malice in his tone, only a wry acceptance. Grace thought of Chicago, of the vicious gossip that had driven her away. Does it bother you? Tucker looked down at her, his expression serious. Only if it bothers you. She shook her head. I find I don't care what people say anymore. His smile was slow, genuine. Good. Neither do I. As winter gave way to spring, Tucker became a regular visitor at the store and at Grace's table. They developed a comfortable routine. He would help her close up shop, they would share a meal, and then talk late into the evening. Sometimes he read to her from books he borrowed from the school teacher, his deep voice bringing the words to life. Sometimes she played the small piano her uncle had kept upstairs, filling the room with music Tucker claimed he'd never heard anything so beautiful. The townsfolk no longer gossiped quite so much. Tucker and Grace had become a familiar pair, accepted if somewhat unexpected. Mrs. Winters, who had initially been skeptical, now nodded approvingly when they walked together on Sundays. One warm evening in late April, they sat on the porch behind the store, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular colors. Tucker had been quieter than usual all evening, and Grace sensed something was troubling him. Is everything all right? She asked gently, turning to face him. Tucker looked down at his hands. Got a letter today, from an old friend in the Rangers. They're asking me to come back. Help with a situation down near the border. Grace felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. Are you going? He was silent for a long moment. I don't know. Time was. I wouldn't have hesitated, but now. Now? He met her eyes. Now there's you. The simple words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Grace's heart pounded as Tucker reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. I care for you, Grace. More than I thought possible after... He swallowed hard. After what happened before. What happened before? She asked softly, encouraging him to continue. Tucker looked away, his jaw tight. I was married once. Her name was Sarah. We had a son, James. His voice grew rough. Fever took them both 3 years ago. I was away, working with the Rangers. Didn't even get to say goodbye. Grace squeezed his hand, tears pricking at her eyes. I'm so sorry, Tucker. After that, I left the Rangers. Couldn't bear it anymore. Came here, took work at the Broken Spur. Thought I'd never feel anything again. His eyes returned to hers. Then you arrived. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. And I care for you, Tucker. So much. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When their lips met, it was gentle, questioning. Grace responded, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palm. When they parted, Tucker rested his forehead against hers. I won't go to the border, he said quietly. My life is here now. The following Sunday, Tucker took Grace riding, leading her to a beautiful spot overlooking a bend in the river. Wildflowers carpeted the ground, and a lone oak provided shade against the strengthening sun. They spread a blanket and shared the lunch Grace had packed. After they ate, Tucker grew serious again. There's something else I need to tell you, he began, about Sarah and James. Grace waited patiently, sensing his need to unburden himself. After they died, He took a deep breath. I couldn't cry. Not at the funeral, not after. It was like something in me had frozen solid. The other Rangers thought I was strong. Truth was, I was broken. He plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between his fingers. First time I cried was 6 months later, sitting alone in a saloon in some forgotten town, staring into a cup of coffee. Hit me all at once, what I'd lost. Couldn't stop the tears. Oh, Tucker, Grace murmured, her heart aching for him. When I came to Shafter, I thought I'd put it all behind me, thought I'd never feel that kind of pain again. But you can't stop feeling without stopping everything, I guess. Grace moved closer, resting her head against his shoulder. And now? Now I feel everything, the good and the bad. He turned to look at her, vulnerability in his eyes. And that terrifies me because if I lost you too. Grace cupped his face in her hands. I'm not going anywhere, Tucker Sloane. He kissed her then, more urgently than before, and she responded in kind, pouring all her feelings into the embrace. Later, as they rode back to town, Tucker said, There's a plot of land for sale, just outside of town. Good water, good grazing. Been thinking of buying it, building something there. Grace glanced at him, catching his meaning. That sounds like a substantial commitment. Tucker smiled, the first truly carefree smile she had seen from him. Thought I might need a substantial place, if I'm to have a family again someday. The warmth that spread through Grace had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. As summer approached, Tucker purchased the land and began building a house. Grace often rode out after closing the store to watch his progress. He worked alongside the carpenters he'd hired, his shirt clinging to him in the heat as he hauled lumber and drove nails. This is going to be a beautiful home, Grace said one evening as they sat on a pile of lumber sharing a canteen of water. Our home, Tucker said simply, watching her face for a reaction. Grace's breath caught. Tucker? He set aside the canteen and took both her hands in his. I know it hasn't been that long, but I've never been more sure of anything. I love you, Grace Ellwood. Will you marry me? Tears sprang to Grace's eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. Tucker let out a whoop that startled a nearby horse, then pulled Grace to her feet and swung her around in a circle. When he set her down, he kissed her with such tenderness that her knees went weak. I never thought I'd have this again, he said, his voice thick with emotion. A chance at happiness, at family. Grace thought of her own past, of the hurt and scandal she had fled. Neither did I, she admitted, but here we are. They were married in the church in Shafter on a perfect June day. Grace wore a simple white dress ordered from San Antonio, with wildflowers in her hair. Tucker looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit, his usually tanned face clean-shaven for the occasion. Mrs. Winters cried openly during the ceremony, while the men from the Broken Spur cheered when Tucker kissed his bride. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with dancing and feasting and more than a few toasts to the unlikely couple who had found each other against all odds. They moved into the new house even though it wasn't quite finished, eager to begin their life together. Tucker continued to work at the Broken Spur, while Grace kept the store running, hiring a local boy to help with deliveries and heavy lifting. One evening in late August, Grace arrived home to find Tucker sitting alone at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee before him, tears streaming silently down his face. "Tucker?" she asked, alarmed, rushing to his side. "What is it? What's happened?" He looked up at her, his blue eyes swimming. Today would have been James's birthday. He would have been 6. His voice broke. "I didn't think I still could." "Still could what?" Grace asked gently, kneeling beside him. "Cry like this. Thought I'd done all my crying that day in the saloon." He wiped roughly at his cheeks. "I'm sorry, Grace. Didn't mean for you to find me like this." Grace reached for his hand. "Don't apologize for grieving, Tucker. They were your family. You loved them." "And I love you," he said fiercely. "So much it scares me sometimes." Grace rose and moved behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "I know. I feel the same way." Tucker pulled her around and onto his lap, burying his face against her neck. "How did I get so lucky? Finding you." "I believe we found each other," Grace replied, stroking his hair. "And I think Sarah would be glad you're not alone." Tucker was quiet for a long moment, then nodded against her shoulder. "She would have liked you." They sat together as the coffee grew cold, holding each other, sharing their pain and their love in equal measure. As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Grace began to suspect she was with child. She waited until she was certain before telling Tucker, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. One crisp October evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, she took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "Tucker," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "we're going to have a baby." His eyes widened, disbelief giving way to joy. "A baby?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Are you sure?" Grace nodded, tears of happiness threatening to spill. "Dr. Matthews confirmed it yesterday. In the spring, we'll be parents." Tucker's hand on her stomach trembled slightly. "A baby," he whispered again, wonder in his voice. Then he was pulling her into his arms, laughing and crying at once, spinning her around the room until she begged him to stop before she became dizzy. When he set her down, his expression grew serious. "I'll be a good father, Grace. I promise." "I know you will," she replied, touching his face tenderly. "You already were once." The months passed, and Grace's body changed with the growing life inside her. Tucker was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting she hire additional help at the store and fussing over her constantly. Grace bore it with good humor, understanding the fear that drove his concern. News came from the Rangers again, requesting Tucker's assistance with tracking a gang that had been terrorizing settlements near the border. This time, Tucker didn't even consider the request, sending back a polite but firm refusal. His place was with his wife and coming child. Spring arrived, bringing new life to the land. The house was fully finished now, with a nursery painted yellow and furnished with a cradle Tucker had made himself. Grace found him there often, running his hand over the smooth wood, a mixture of anticipation and trepidation on his face. Their son was born on a stormy night in April, arriving after a long and difficult labor that left Tucker pacing outside the bedroom door, wearing a path in the floor as he waited. When the midwife finally invited him in, he approached the bed with trepidation, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in Grace's arms. "We have a son," Grace said tiredly, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. "Would you like to hold him?" Tucker reached for the baby with trembling hands. The infant was tiny, with a shock of dark hair and, when he blinked up at his father, eyes of the clearest blue. "Hello, little one," Tucker whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm your pa." "I thought we might call him Jasper, after my uncle," Grace said, watching the two most important people in her world. "And perhaps James as a middle name?" Tucker looked up, tears shining in his eyes. "Jasper James Sloane," he repeated, testing the name. "It's perfect. He's perfect." As spring turned to summer, the Sloane family settled into a rhythm. Tucker continued to work at the Broken Spur, but arranged his schedule to be home more. Grace reopened the store part-time, bringing little Jasper with her, to the delight of the customers who cooed over the handsome baby boy. On warm evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, Jasper sleeping peacefully in Tucker's arms. They spoke of the future, of the life they were building together, of the family they had become. "Did you ever imagine this?" Tucker asked one evening, his voice soft so as not to wake the baby. "When you first came to Shafter, did you ever think you'd end up here, with me?" Grace smiled, reaching over to touch his arm. "No, but I'm so glad I did." "That day you found me crying over my coffee," Tucker said, his expression thoughtful. "I thought I'd hit rock bottom again, but it was actually the beginning of something beautiful." He looked down at Jasper, then back at Grace. "You saved me, you know. Brought me back to life." "We saved each other," Grace corrected gently. "And now we have this little one to love." Tucker nodded, his eyes full of emotion. "And maybe, someday, another one or two?" Grace laughed. "Let's master caring for this one first, shall we?" As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Tucker leaned over to kiss her, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I love you, Grace Sloane," he murmured against her lips. "And I love you, Tucker Sloane," she replied, her heart full to bursting. "More than I ever thought possible." 5 years later, the Sloane Ranch had prospered. Tucker had left the Broken Spur to work his own land, raising horses that were becoming known throughout the region for their quality. Grace had sold the store but maintained ownership of the building, renting it to a young couple from the East who reminded her of herself when she had first arrived in Shafter. Jasper, now 5, was a spirited boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick mind. He had been joined by a 3-year-old sister, Sarah, named for Tucker's first wife in a gesture that had brought healing to old wounds, and a baby brother, Thomas, just 6 months old. On this particular evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Tucker looked around at the faces of his wife and children, his expression one of contentment and wonder. "What are you thinking?" Grace asked, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "I was thinking about how full life can be," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "How empty mine was before you, and how rich it is now." Grace's smile was radiant. "From tears and coffee to this," she said softly, "we've come a long way." "And we have a long way yet to go," Tucker replied, squeezing her hand. "Together." Outside, the Texas sun set on another day, gilding the land that had witnessed their journey from strangers to family, from grief to joy, from solitude to love. And in the hearts of Tucker and Grace Sloane, that love continued to grow, as enduring as the wild and beautiful land they called home.